So how did you know that you were living what I guess you could term is a new type of monasticism? From what I gathered from our past discussions, it's not something that was verbalized so much back then. So how did you first get the inkling or the idea or the terminology into your head?
That's right. Well, that was in 1979, and I'd never heard anybody mention new monasticism. There was a communities movement going on, and I'm going to talk about that inside the site. But it wasn't until 1981 that I actually discovered what we'd been living. And at that time, Linda and I were at theological college. I was training to be a priest in the Anglican Communion. I was a great fan of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. My parish priest gave me the cost of discipleship when I was a young believer. And if anybody knows the cost of discipleship and what it's actually got in it, it's very challenging. And at theological college, I had a chance to study Bonhoeffer more deeply. But actually, what happened was by chance, you could say, although it was by God's circumstance. I was rooting in the library one day, and I found a book, and it had a letter by Bonhoeffer to his brother. And this was written in 1934, and basically he said something like this: the renewal of the church will come from a new type of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old, but an allegiance to the Sermon on the Mount. It's high time we gathered people together to do this.
Well, I've got the exact quote here. got written down.
Thank you.
So this is what Bonhoeffer actually said. He said, "The restoration of the church will surely come only from a new type of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old, but a complete lack of compromise, and a life lived in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount in the discipleship of Christ. I think it's time to gather men together to do this." What's the difference there? Obviously, is it just your memories going?
No, it's not my memories. I put my hand up because I actually paraphrased Bonhoeffer's quote. One, because it was kind of the thing to do. It was politically correct at that time not to talk about men, and I thought Bonhoeffer was a bit long-winded. But actually, his quote that's the right quote, and it is the best one. But it was my paraphrase that went whizzing around the internet. And it was real funny because a couple of years ago somebody sent us an email saying, "Look, I discovered new monasticism," and he quoted as my paraphrase and saying he'd found it in the Cost of Discipleship. And I'd actually said it was in the Cost of Discipleship, and it wasn't. It was in that letter. So Bonhoeffer, that's the correct phrase. And the restoration of the church is a much better phrase than the renewal of the church. So,
but for you, what's the difference between restoration and renewal? Why is it better?
Restoration has got a fuller and a deeper meaning in terms of Bonhoeffer speaking from a European perspective. He's speaking at a time when his own country, 1935, at that time Hitler was emerging. There was an alternative view of society was emerging. And Bonhoeffer could see that there needed to be a response, there needed to be a reaction. And his response was a new type of monasticism that would shout on the church, which would cheer the church to actually stand up and face the new challenge that was coming. So renewal's a little bit lighter, I think. Restoration's much deeper. It means about building something strong. And building on old and solid foundations, but building something new.
So for me, that's the important thing with restoration, is if you restore an old house, you don't chuck the old house. You're working on it and repairing it, and hopefully doing it with some integrity. And if you're doing it in a beautiful area, it's in keeping with the area.
Yeah.
It's being authentic to what was there before.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bonhoeffer was a card-carrying churchman. He was a Lutheran. He believed in the visible church, and he's often used to support the Enlightenment view of the importance of the individual. But Bonhoeffer was a guy who was committed to the church, and I am too. And I think new monasticism should be committed to the church, and we'll be looking at that inside.
Okay. So your first person who helped you out was dead, for want of a better phrase. So he couldn't do much more on a one-to-one basis, I guess you could say. But were there any living people? Were there any people who got alongside you? Yeah. Anyone older and wiser, or younger and wiser maybe, you never know?
Yeah, there was somebody older and wiser, and he's the dearest man I've ever met. And he's called Brother Roland Walls. And Roland's a monk in the old desert tradition, and I met him again at theological college. I was coming back from somewhere, and the bishop's chauffeur-driven car pulled up outside the college. And out of this car came this guy who looked like a wayfarer, a little bloke wayfarer with a pipe in his mouth. And the chauffeur opened the boot of the car, which was nearly the size of a car. And Roland went in and got his, it was a carrier bag from some shop, right? And in it was his clothes and his notes, and off he wandered into the college. I had no idea who he was. And he was doing a lecture that night on contemplative prayer, and I wasn't keen to go, because at college we used to have these long lectures on contemplative prayer that would put you off praying, to be honest. But I was in a bit of a spiritual crisis myself, and I'd heard this was a guy who had something to say, so I thought I'd go, and I sat in the class. And Roland got up in his wayfarer's clothes, and he said this. Now, contemplative prayer, this is what it's about. It's about having a deep relationship with Jesus. And I thought, oh, aye, okay. And then he shared a story about going on a holiday to Patmos. And on this holiday, he decided to go and meet the monk of Patmos, and he walked along to see him, and there was a woman come back the other way, and she said, I hope you're not going to see that nutter monk, because he's a complete idiot. She said, I've sat there for half an hour with him, and all he talks about is trees and flowers. You know, I've come for my spiritual feeding, and he's talking about nothing. So Roland thought, okay, so Roland went, and the monk never said anything. Just sat for half an hour saying nothing. So Roland thought, oh, he really knows me, he knows what I'm like. So after half an hour he got up to go, and then the monk came and embraced him, and he said this to him. Those who lean on Jesus' breast hear the heartbeat of God. Go and do it. And Roland gave up his parish, and he ended up living in a garden hut behind an old miner's hut. They used to build miners' huts out of corrugated iron. And Roland's place was on this really posh Edinburgh street, and you had this corrugated iron building, and behind it was two garden huts that two brothers lived in, Roland and John, and they had two garden huts put together for the chapel. And during the time I knew Roland, 10 years, people from all over the world came there. To say that monasticism is something separate from life is total rubbish. These guys influenced so many people who were both in the church and outside of the church, and through their simple life they changed so many people. And when I first went to see Roland, I went up late one night, it was about 8 o'clock, and I knocked on his door, well, the side door, and a voice came and said, "Who is it?" And I said, I'm from Newton Aycliffe. And he said, "I don't know where Newton Aycliffe is. What do you want?" And I said, "I've come to see you." And he said, "I don't want to see you, clear off." And I said, "God sent me to see you." He said, "Don't be so stupid. How can you say God sent you to see me?" And I said, "If God sent me to see you, you are definitely going to be in. So I'm here to see you, and I want to see you now." And he let out this just joyful laugh. I mean, he's got this infectious laughter. And I went inside, and we sat all night and talked. He smokes a pipe, and he would laugh so hard that the sparks would come off, and his jumper would be on fire. And he was animated, talking about the Lord and the things of God, and his jumper would be on fire, and I'd say, "Roland, your jumper's on fire." And he'd say, "Oh, don't worry, let's just keep on with what we're saying." So Roland was a great mentor, and I simply learned from him by going to be with him. And I travel up to where he lived, and he doesn't like that to be publicised, and I would just stay for a couple of days, and I learned more by the way he lived than by what he said. And Roland realised that there needed to be a monastic renewal. He was supportive of new monasticism. So it was a bit like an apprenticeship, and Linda and I will be eternally grateful to Roland Walls. I know Andy Rain will as well, because Roland played a big part in Andy's life too.